Particles are one of the most powerful tools in Geometry 2.2. It would be particularly useful for animations, randomizations, and spawning lots of objects at once. You can find the main particle editor in the first object here. Click Edit Special to open up the menu. You can see the basic sliders, the particle preview, the mode of the particles, and pages to other settings. In each slider, you will realize there is a plus-minus number on the right. That makes the value of the slider become a range of values instead of a single value. For example, 0 plus minus 10 means the value of the slider can be anywhere random from 0 to 10. This is very important for randomization and creating natural-looking particles. So let's talk about the basic settings. Max particles, from its name, specifies the maximum amount of particles that can appear on the screen. Once the number of particles reaches this amount, they will stop spawning. However, if we want more particles to spawn at once, we can adjust the emission and lifetime. Emission is how frequently the particles spawn. If a larger emission is used, particles will spawn faster until they reach the max particles amount. Lifetime is how long the particles would stay on the screen before they disappears. Duration is the duration which new particle spawns until they reach the max particles limit. This is not the duration of the particle effect. So if you have the lifetime longer than the duration, the particles will not disappear immediately after the duration. It is just that no new particles spawns. You can also click the Inf button to make the duration infinite. There are two buttons next to emissions. Max will make emission the maximum and make all particles spawn at once. For example, if you want to create an explosion effect, you can set the emission to maximum and the duration to be less than lifetime. Calc will calculate the emission rate such that particles keep spawning evenly. Angle is the direction that particles travel towards. Speed is the speed of the particles, and if you don't want them to move, then set it to 0. Posevar X and Y refers to a box where particles can spawn randomly in. You can see the green box in the particle preview, and that is where particles can spawn. Gravity X and Y refers to the gravity of the particles. A higher gravity means particles will have a higher acceleration toward that axis. Accelerad is the radial acceleration. A positive number means accelerate away from the center, and a negative number means towards the center. You can create these really cool-looking balls if the particles accelerate towards the center. Acceltan is the tangential acceleration. This is mainly used to make particles travel in a curve. For example, to create arrows that moves in a curve. Radius mode is not much different from gravity mode. It uses startrad and endrad, which refer to the start and end radius. You can either make particles move towards or away from the center. Rotsec is the rotation in degrees per second. Positive means moving clockwise and negative means anti-clockwise. I believe some effects can also be done using gravity mode, but radius mode just makes creating cool spinning effects easier. In the Visual tab, you can select the start and end size of the particles. Start and end spin refers to the rotation of the particle themselves. You don't really have to focus on the RGB sliders below, as you can change the particle's colors on the top left. The first one is the start color. The second one is the end color. And the button on the right just sets the end color to be the same as the start color. You can select the texture of the particles on the Texture tab. If some textures have a color, for example the demon face, they will be tinted as if a pulse trigger of that color is applied to the object. Finally, the C and P buttons here refer to copy and paste, and you can copy settings from one particle to the other. There are numbers 1 to 3 above the preview window that displays different settings depending on the mode. When the setting is displayed, you can drag the line to adjust the value for that setting. You can also move the particle around, and the C button is used to recenter the particles. Finally, the small color box here changes the preview background color. It does not have any actual effect on the particle. If you have used the old particles in the 2.1 editor, you will realize that the particle leaves a trail when you move them around. However, this is not the case when I create a particle that doesn't move here in the new editor. You can change this by heading to the Extra tab and changing the default grouped mode to Free. In Free mode, the particles that have already spawned will not move along with the particle object. You can create interesting animations when the particles leave their trail. But suppose we want to control the camera when the animation is being displayed. If the camera zooms in here, the particles follow along in a weird way. In this situation, we would want to set the particle to relative. In this mode, the particles would still leave their trail when they are being moved, but are unaffected by camera movements. This also allows you to draw lines using particles by using the keyframe system. Use the keyframe objects to create a path that you want to draw. Then set the particle to follow the keyframes and set it to free or relative. Now you can use a keyframe trigger to make the particle draw some shapes. Fade in and fade out apply the effects to the particles within their lifetime. This won't extend the lifetime of the particles. Friction P applies friction to the particles. That means they gradually slows down until they stops. It is similar to negative accel rad, except that it stops the particles and won't reverse their direction. Friction R applies the same idea of friction, but to the particle's rotation. The rotation slows down and eventually stops. However, I can't think of any actual applications to this. Friction S adjusts the friction to the particle speed, but I couldn't really figure out what it does. Respawn adjusts the respawn rate of the particles, but I couldn't find a difference when adjusting it. Additive applies blending to the particle's color, so the color would be solid if it is disabled. Start size equals end makes the start and end size of the particles the same. Suppose you want particles of size from 0 to 20 to spawn, but you want the size of them to be kept the same. You cannot do that in the standard settings because each start size is mapped to a range of values. The same idea applies to start spin equals end. Start rad equals end works in radius mode. It doesn't seem to make the start radius become the end radius. Instead, it makes the particles never move inwards, even when end radius is smaller than start radius. Start rot equals dire makes particles travel in the direction that matches the spin of the particles when they start spawning. This is very similar to dynamic rotation, except that start rot equals dir only considers the spin when the particles started spawning, while dynamic rotation keeps track of the direction of the particles and rotate the particles towards it. Dynamic rotation can be used to create indication arrows that moves in a curve when you adjust the Excel tan setting. Use Obj Color makes the particles use color from the Edit Object tab. This could be useful as it allows copying colors from one particle to the other using the Copy Values button. Animate on Trigger makes the particle to only start spawning when it is added to a group, and an Animate trigger activates it. This is one of the most important settings in this tab. Animate active only makes the particle to animate only when it is active, which is used together with animate on trigger. Order sensitive makes new particles appear on top of old ones. This would be more obvious if a colored object is used, as you can see the new hard faces appear on top of the old ones. Start and end RGB sync is used when the RGB colors have a variance. Instead of a range of new colors, they will have the same color as the start and end colors, but just with a different brightness. And lastly, quick start makes particles enters their constant movement instantly when they enters view. You will understand this with these two particles. The spawn particle trigger spawns one or more particles at a location. You can add particles to a group and spawn them at the location of another group. That doesn't work here because the particles cannot have infinite duration for some reason. If there are multiple particles added to a group, all of them will be spawned at once. In the menu, offset X and Y offsets the position that particles spawn. Off var X and Y gives a variance on the spawning position on the X and Y axis. You can set the rotation and scale here. Match rot makes the rotation of the particles match. Note that the position group should only contain one object. If it contains more than one object, it seems like one object will be chosen in random to spawn the particles in.